my name is Lawrence Jacober. I head up product marketing for Google Cloud for multi-cloud security. And I'm here to talk a little bit today about what we can do to ultimately finally move on from saying bye-bye to DIY. Now, the key thing for me is to obviously first find the clicker. But the second thing is, when you think about this overall, right, you're probably wondering, hey, why should we even say bye-bye to DIY, right? And I think the reality that most of us have to deal with is that at the end of the day, right, our defenses and our detections aren't really all that effective, right? If we look at, for example, all the incident response engagements that Mandiant was involved in last year, right? So for 2023, you probably heard Kevin Mandia talk about that in the keynote yesterday. But if we look at all of those incident response engagements, right, and we sort of say, hey, out of those, how many of those incidents were actually notified, or the organizations were actually notified by an external party? It ended up being 56%, right? So a different way to think about that is more than half of those organizations didn't actually detect they had been breached until they'd been notified by an external party. So when we think about that, obviously in the context of SecOps, that is not something that we ultimately want to find out, right? Now, for that not to happen, really what we're really looking for is that we want a fully functional, high-performing SOC, right? We want, at the end of the day, a SecOps program that really just works, right? That we don't really have to think about, that's where it's easy and quick to understand, to detect, to investigate, and to respond to threats, right? And ideally, obviously, to do that for all the latest threats. The only problem is, at the end of the day, that's generally not what we actually get at all, right, in our security operations centers or in our SecOps programs. What we actually get is usually a bunch of building blocks, right? Probably seems a little bit like IKEA to some degree, right? Like, hey, here, some assembly is obviously required, right? We have to do many, many things ourselves, right? We have to take a data lake, figure out how that looks. We've got a bunch of detection rules, right? We obviously have a number of threat feeds that we probably need to integrate on our own, right? We've got a bunch of responses that we need to curate and create. And at the end of the day, we very often seem like this person, right? The DIY guy. I think we all probably know somebody like this, right? Who's like, hey, you know what? At the end of the day, we try to do a lot of these things ourselves, where I have a new camera, I have a new light, maybe I should do the electrical myself. You know what? Why not, right? What could go wrong? Well, the reality is I think we've all been there, right? And I think we all know that many things can go wrong. So this is actually a photo of the footwell of my old Mazda. And I had actually one of the pedals break off. And I thought, you know what? How hard can it be to fix, right? Probably pretty easy. Well, it turns out, no, not really, actually. The picture here with the black plastic bit on the bottom, that's actually the fix. That's not the broken part. So the conclusion I ultimately came to here at the end of the day was, right, in my case, it's probably a whole lot better to focus on driving, right, versus trying to actually fix the car itself. Now, when we think about that in the context of SecOps, right, it's really the same thing, right? How do we get out of this idea of having to ultimately think about how do we create the system and more around how do we use the system really for high-value activity? And at the end of the day, that really is what we mean by, hey, how do we get rid of DIY in security operations? Now, when we think of security operations, right, much like every other origin story, right, it usually starts with some sort of lake. You know, in our case, it's the security data lake. So when we think about security data lake, most of us think that DIY is a thing of the past. But I do want to ask if you can raise your hand if you are actually still stacking and racking boxes for your data lake. Anybody? No? Okay, awesome. Super happy about that, because my talk track would have been a little tricky if loads of people raised their hand there. So one of the things, though, that we have seen is cloud really is the way to go when it comes to security data lakes, right? But not all cloud data lakes really are created equal, right? When we think about this from our perspective, what we see is we have a lot of on-prem folks. They kind of lifted and shifted their capabilities, right? Moved them to the cloud. But the question there really remains, hey, are they really taking advantage of all the inherent scalability and all the inherent benefits of that architecture to ultimately really get the scale and the speed that you need, right, to do your jobs? Now, there's also a bunch of SIEMs and data lakes that were born in the cloud, right? Loads of those exist, of course. Obviously, Google is one of those, right? But when we work with customers, we still very often get some common questions, right? And one of those questions is, hey, can we actually afford to ingest this data source? We also get a question of, well, once we actually make that decision, how long should we store it, right? Do we store it for 30, 60, 90 days, longer, right? What does that mean economically, right? What does that mean from an effort perspective? But at the end of the day, if you are ultimately deciding between what data should I be storing, how long should I be keeping it, our assertion is that you're ultimately on the wrong platform and that you're really knee-deep in DIY. Now, we all know, and we've all heard, I'm sure, many, many times, right, that data is essential to SecOps. I think that's no surprise to anybody, right? But we've also seen that from a security operations perspective, we've had many folks tell us, hey, it is a big data problem, right? And the big thing there, though, is ultimately, at the end of the day, what do we do with all that data, right? And probably the first and most important thing is all around detection engineering. Now, detection engineering, for the most part, right, is really the most labor-intensive and probably the most DIY thing we do in SecOps. Now, when we think about it at I would say at a larger level, right, it's pretty hard to do well. It's hard to do well because we all know, right, I think we spent the last couple of days hearing about how much the threat landscape just keeps evolving, right? It's hard because of that. But at the end of the day, does it need to be hard, right? Should it be hard? Our assertion is if we look at all of the detection engineering that's being done on our platform, right, we see a whole lot of overlap. So in other words, we see about 90% or so of the detections that some customers create are actually the same for everybody, right? They're ultimately things that you don't have to create yourself. So really the big piece for us here is that at the end of the day, we think about that as something that you can actually leave to the pros, and you can actually help us create those detections. Now, we're not saying that all detections, right, will be out of the box created by somebody else. Of course not, right? There will always be a small percentage that you'll do that's specific either to your environment, to your vertical, to your requirements, right, whatever it is. But the gist is what you ultimately want to do is keep those detections that you're authoring yourself to a relatively small number, right? Now, we are trying to approach this from an overall Google curated detection perspective, meaning for the 90% of those detections, a Google expert is actually leveraging the unrivaled visibility that we have into the threat landscape, and they are creating, and bless you, they're creating and developing and maintaining those detections for you, right? So it's not just, hey, we create them once they're done, right? It's also making sure as things evolve that they are ultimately maintained and that they're up to date with the latest threats. Now, some of you have probably heard of the big yellow taxi, right? Now, if you haven't heard of the big yellow taxi story, at the end of the day, this is something that happened relatively recently where the State Department suffered a breach because of an exploit and a vulnerability in their email system. Now, I think at this point, obviously, I have to say that from our perspective, Google Workspace and Gmail is obviously born in the cloud and has very, very powerful built-in security. But from a security operations perspective, right, the State Department ultimately determined that this was happening because they built a very complex, very sophisticated detection rule, which they ultimately called Big Yellow Taxi. Now, most of the folks that we talk to don't have the resources of the State Department, right, for that detection engineering. So in this particular scenario, right, we've invested in ultimately creating those detections for Workspace so you can ultimately implement those with the appropriate data in your environment without having to write anything on your end at all. But I think it's also important to remember that, as I said earlier, there will always be some DIY that your teams will need to do when it comes to detection engineering. But at the end of the day, that little that you still want to do, you ultimately want to turn that into doing it with AI, right? And when I say doing it with AI, I ultimately mean at the end of the day, you can leverage that technology to help you scale and go much, much faster. while probably the most important thing from your team's perspective, right, you can also help reduce the toil associated with it. Now, if we look at this particular video here, right, you can see that you can do detection engineering with AI, right? You can create a detection for a specific case using Gemini AI in our Google Security Operations platform. You can see how that particular detection is actually generated, right, based on a request for this particular case. You can then also see how we've opened this in a rule editor, right? So you can modify it, you can adjust it, you can ultimately change it. The real key here is customers who started using this, right, talk about mainly the toil and the time savings that they're ultimately seeing because they've got a starting point, right? They don't have to be super familiar with a specific language, right? They can all do this in a natural language, of course, in terms of prompting the AI system. But really, at the end of the day, it is a time-saving scenario. Now, we talked a bunch about detection engineering, right? Super important, of course, right? Probably the lifeblood of SecOps. But when we think about detection engineering, the other sort of key piece there is really that we also need to think about threat intelligence. And when it comes to threat intelligence, another kind of quick poll here, how many folks in the room have a dedicated threat intel team? Can you please raise your hand? Okay, a few of you. If you could also raise your hand if you have bought threat intel feeds. Yep, quite a few, okay. And please keep your hand up if you don't mind, and drop it only if you've bought one feed. Okay, 5 feeds? Okay. So the key here really is, right, at the end of the day, a lot of folks who have threat intel feeds do all of the research, all of the deduplication, all of the operationalization of all of that threat intelligence on their own, right? Once again, in a sort of a DIY type of approach. And when we look at that in general, right, talking to threat intel teams, it takes a lot of work, right? And generally, if something is a lot of work, it means it moves relatively slowly, right? And if it moves relatively slowly, you're talking days, weeks, maybe months, right, to potentially address a new threat. And obviously, from our perspective, that's really not good enough, right? Now, when you're not actually have a dedicated intel team, or when you're not doing that kind of work, obviously the outcome can be even worse. Now, we actually just announced Google Threat Intelligence as an offering yesterday to the market, so hopefully you saw the news there. But we believe that, probably obviously, right, we believe this includes all of the properties of what a good threat intel solution really offers, right? And when we think about that, what are those properties? Well, it's really 2 kind of key buckets, right? The first is all about breadth, and the second is all about depth. Now, when we think about it from our perspective, right, there's, I would say, the depth perspective, or the depth scenario, which is all about looking at frontline and curated threat intelligence, right? So this is the type of threat intelligence that you only get when you're involved in thousands or over 1,000 incident response engagements every year with Mandiant experts, right, on the front lines, being called in if somebody has a security incident, and then ultimately investigating it, determining what's going on, et cetera. There's also the threat intelligence research component there that's super important. And then the other piece that's really added from a breadth perspective is really what we call as crowdsourced intelligence, right? And that's really part of what we get from our VirusTotal community. So I would assume probably a lot of you or a lot of your teams actually use VirusTotal. Being able to actually leverage a lot of that community contribution, right, is super valuable. And the last piece really here when we think about sort of the threat intelligence puzzle is that we also obviously run quite a few properties on the internet that are very popular, right? So we have some great insight into what is happening in terms of attacks and the threat landscape as it relates to our properties from a Google perspective. Now, when we combine all of these things, right, you get a pretty unique, and we would argue probably differentiated view into what is actually happening in the threat landscape on any given day. And the other kind of key areas of focus for us with Google Threat Intel is really probably 2 things that resonate with any threat intel team. The first is, how do we make it actionable, right? How do we make it easy to consume, whatever your system is, right? And then also, how do we do it fast, right? So how do we do things in days or hours versus in weeks or months, right? Now, once again, you can imagine, right, when it comes to threat intel, AI can help. You can simply ask, in this particular scenario, right, Gemini AI, a natural language question, right? You can say, hey, in this particular piece, it's what's Hangman v2? Now, the great news here is Gemini goes out and looks at dozens, if not hundreds of articles, right? It ultimately determines what the answers are, it summarizes it, and brings it back to you in an interface, right? Now, all of those responses cover all the insight that we've captured either from Mandiant or from VirusTotal or from Google Threat Research. And the good news here is that we are actually even able to go deeper. So if you have a follow-up question, right, as you can see here, hey, how does it actually persist? Once again, you'll get an answer, right? So when you think about this from a threat analyst perspective, the great news here is, once again, you're removing that toil, you're speeding up the process, right? And you're ultimately helping them do their job much, much quicker and much, much better. Now, when we think about threat intel, yes, there's obviously intel summaries and search and all of that, which is great, right? But the key is also really to apply threat intel, right? When we think about how do we do threat intel and how do we apply it, that's probably the most important thing for us. So when we think about that from a Google security operations perspective, we actually match 12 months of our hot telemetry against all the Google threat intelligence I just talked about. And I just want to let that sink in for a second, right? Because this is not just, hey, new data, right? This is essentially all the data that's currently in your environment. Now, we also enrich that threat intel data not only with, let's say, hey, here's an IOC, right? But all the things that are associated with it, whether it's the TTPs, right, that are ultimately part of that. And then you can use all of that across your whole threat detection, investigation, and response workflow. And you can ultimately get to a point where you ask things like, hey, am I actually being targeted by a specific threat actor group? Versus saying, oh, let me find this IP or this URL or whatever it is, right? Now, we also, obviously, when we look at threat intelligence and applying threat intelligence, we want to make sure that we surface anything that we believe is important, right? So how do we prioritize alerts, right? How do we make sure that we include what we call our active breach intelligence? In other words, intelligence that comes from us from active incident response engagements that are being done by the Mandiant team, and how do we surface that in your environment, right? And then finally, how do we take all that insight, right? How do we take all those TTPs and actually turn them into curated detections, right? So the curated detections I talked about earlier ultimately are all fed by this insight. So the end result really here is, at the end of the day, right, you've got turnkey outcomes, but without any of the overhead of the engineering that's generally associated with this type of approach. Now, I think the big question always is, how do we know, right, automatically, ideally, right, but it's probably a big ask, but how do we know automatically what happens on the front lines in terms of security incidents, and if that applies to my organization, right, or to my environment? And usually the way that we actually look at this is based on the latest incidents that we're actually involved in. And we try to think about that in three sort of key dimensions, right? The first is, well, how long does it actually take from the initial discovery to protection, right? Is that something that when you think about your SecOps system, right, should it be days? Should it be hours? Should it be minutes? Right? We obviously have an opinion there. We believe it should be as low as it possibly can be, right? The same as, well, how far back do you look, right? If you try to do this manually from a DIY perspective, are you trying to look at things like, okay, the last couple of days since it's happened, or are you saying, you know what, let me look across my entire data set for ideally a year or more, right, to determine if that particular vulnerability or exploit or whatever, right, has actually been present in your environment. And then the last thing, which is probably the most important, especially for this talk, right, is how much work is it? How manual is it for your teams to do all of this, right? We obviously have an opinion there too, which is at the end of the day, hey, it shouldn't be a lot of work, right? It should ultimately be really out of the box from that perspective. Now, I think the other piece from a threat intelligence perspective that's important is to be super transparent, right? It's to ultimately show, for example, if we have an indicator confidence score, like we do in Google Security Operations, how is that actually calculated, right? And how do we illustrate and factor in the unique things in your environment to be able to actually show you exactly how we came up with that particular score versus it just being a black box and your analysts really have no idea why we think it's important, where it came from, et cetera, et cetera. Now that transparency is obviously very important for us. But what's also important is how do we actually use all of that insight in your searches, right? In your detections, which makes it even more powerful, right? So if we think about this in the context of the example I gave earlier, right? You can actually create a very easy search here where you say, hey, am I being targeted, for example, by APT43? You don't need to do anything other than that, right? Except ask that particular question, which is pretty cool. Now we've sort of talked about, data lakes. We've talked about what do we do from a detection engineering perspective. We talked about threat intel, right? Obviously, the next key part of the workflow is what do we do from an investigation perspective. And I think here it's probably good to just take a step back and talk a little bit about what do we generally see as the problems that most SOCs are currently facing. And this is one of my favorite pieces of research of the year that comes out from the SANS group, where they ultimately survey a number of SOC leaders and SOC practitioners and say, hey, what are the challenges that you're running into? And I think if you look at the sort of list, many of these, A, you'll probably recognize, but B, we've already talked about, right? One of them is lack of automation and orchestration. Obviously, that's an issue for a lot of folks, right? Too many tools unintegrated. Well, that's a favorite of everybody's, I think. High staffing requirements, right? How do you offload those? But probably what I want to focus on here, and which is ultimately the number one problem, is the lack of context of what defenders are actually seeing, right? So, hey, a defender sees something in their environment, they don't know much more, right? That actual context is super, super important for their investigation. And usually the way it currently works is, right, to be able to actually piece that puzzle together with all of that insight is done in a DIY manner, right? So when we think about this from our perspective, once again, we believe AI can really help here. So in this particular scenario, you actually see Gemini AI bring in all of the context that you actually need from an enrichment perspective to this particular case, to the point where you can even see that the investigative assistant, which will come up in a second, actually enables your analysts to ask questions based on what they're seeing, and actually enables those particular folks to try to find those needles in the haystack of data relatively easily, right? And our real goal here is to try to surface all of that context for your team right through the interface without having to write any enrichment rules, without having to do anything along those lines, just to make it, once again, easier and faster without all the overhead that you're expecting. Now, when it comes to investigation, AI can also help with code analysis, right? So this is very much a, I would say, specialized skill set, right, that isn't prevalent in all security operations teams. Now, the VirusTotal team has done a whole bunch of work here. We actually released some capabilities a few months ago called Code Insights, which we've gotten some great feedback on from the community, right? And the net of it is, hey, it tells you and then helps you inspect what code actually does without you having to do the analysis. So in this particular example, right, it's very easy to see the script is a keylogger. How long would it have taken a person to figure that out, right? Well, with the power of AI, it can be very, very quick. Now, the other thing is the vast majority of folks that we talk to from a security operations perspective don't necessarily have that skill set in their SOCs today, right? They don't want to hire for it, they don't want to build it out, et cetera, right? But they want tooling that ultimately helps them do this because at the end of the day, it makes folks' job so much easier. Now, there's lots and lots of opportunity here. I've actually got a great example I'll talk about a little bit later in terms of what's coming next on this particular piece. So we've gone kind of through each of the areas, right? In terms of detection, investigation, and obviously at some point we're going to have to respond, right? And when we think about response, we generally think SOAR, right? And when we think SOAR, we know that that is very much in the DIY world, right? You've got to integrate a bunch of tools, right? Generally, that always changes. You've got to build playbooks, right, based on your environment. Once you've built them, you've got to test them, right, make sure they work. And even once you've done that, you actually need to maintain them, right? Because obviously things change over time, playbooks break, et cetera. How do you deal with all of that? So there's lots of time that's spent on these DIY projects by your team here, right? And obviously, we would love to change that. So as you could probably guess, right, one of the ways that we're trying to do that is we believe AI can really help here. And it can help you with the playbook creation process in particular, right? So bringing context into your environment, using a prompt that actually does the work for you, as you can see here, right? Which is, hey, build a playbook. I'm interested in registry key change alerts, right? I want you to enrich it with all the threat intel that's available associated with it. I want you to enrich it with that entity. I want you to flag if it's suspicious. And I want you to tag the case and prioritize it. Now, as you can see here, right, the Gemini AI capability actually does all of that for you in our usual interface in terms of, okay, how do I actually build a playbook, right? That comes up on the screen, and you can even look at that, modify it as you would normally do whenever you author a playbook. Now, the other piece that's super important for us when it comes to playbooks, as I mentioned, is once you've actually built a playbook or the AI has built a playbook, how do you make sure it does actually what you expect it to do, right? And the key there from our side of it is, well, you can use simulation, right? You can use the simulation capability to actually run the playbook and to make sure that it actually does what it's supposed to, right? So it's a very easy way for you to check on, hey, what I've built or what AI has built is actually doing what it's supposed to, right? So another great capability to just take the DIY out of your particular security operations capability. Now, security operations teams obviously spend a whole lot of time on threat detection, investigation, and response, right? Like we'd already talked about. But the other piece, obviously, that we've seen really make an impact, right, is threat hunting. We've seen that time and time again in research, hey, if I have a well-functioning SecOps team, right, or a well-functioning SOC, I ultimately really want to introduce threat hunting into the picture. But much like malware, reverse engineering, like we talked about before, right, there is a big but there. And the but usually is when we talk to customers, my current team doesn't have the bandwidth, and I don't want to build out the skill set, right? So the question then is ultimately, hey, we know threat hunting is important. How can we do this, right? Now, obviously, selfishly here, Google and Mandiant can absolutely help with that, right? So our elite threat hunters, so the same folks that essentially being used, our Mandiant consultants in terms of our incident response engagements, et cetera, can actually hunt for threats in your actual data set, right? So in your environment. So you generally would have very much intel-driven hunt missions, right? So hey, what are we seeing from a threat landscape perspective? What understanding do we actually have of threat actors? And how do we create hunt missions associated with that? And ideally, you would find undetected threats, right? Using your actual SecOps data from your environment. We would map that to MITRE ATT&CK, and then ultimately that makes it easier for you to take action. Now, no conversation these days, I think, when we talk security operations, is really complete without talking cloud security. Now, you've probably guessed, right? Cloud security isn't at all spared in any way, shape, or form in terms of DIY, right? So both traditional and, I would say, cloud SecOps, at the end of the day, require DIY, right? So we obviously just talked about SecOps in the grand scheme of things, but cloud sec is really no better, right? Whether it's posture for cloud, posture for your data, whether it's security for infrastructure as code, right? There's many, many DIY projects that your teams are dealing with here. And probably what's also very interesting here is your security team or your SecOps team, which might be separate from your cloud team, right, won't be all that happy about having to do all this manual work. So our big recommendation here is at the end of the day, splitting traditional SecOps and cloud SecOps only really made sense when cloud was an experiment. But those days are long gone, right? At this point, nobody's experimenting with cloud, right? That isn't really a scenario anymore. So ultimately, we recommend that you really converge these two functions, right? You reduce the burden, you use the same shared componentry, right? You have the same data lake, the same threat intel, the same detection and response capabilities, the same AI ideally, and probably at some point the same team, because those silos really no longer make sense. Now, as you can kind of imagine, or as you've heard, one DIY SOC is really plenty here, right? Lots of things that we need to do, lots of things that we need to think about, but we also have lots and lots of customers that we actually work with where they have more than one SOC, right? Probably a bunch of you in the room probably have more than one SOC where you either got an extra one through an acquisition, right? Maybe global regions, right? Could be different entities. The list goes on. The most prevalent for us, right, when we have multi-SOC conversations is when it's actually a nation state, right? When you have to think about how do we defend a nation from a security operations perspective. So we've actually worked with various nations to actually formulate an approach for this. And we formulated that approach around how do we secure a nation, and we call it Cyber Shield. Now, Cyber Shield really leverages a federated SOC approach, right? So both at the national and the sectorial level. And it does it with common tech, as you can imagine, right? A standard underlying platform that obviously can scale to the requirements of running many SOCs, right, on the same infrastructure. But it's not just about the tech, really, when you think about Cyber Shield, right? It's also about the common approaches that are here and the best practices from an intel, from a detection, and a response sharing perspective. So how do you do that at scale, right? How do you share that insight between SOCs? How can they action it, et cetera, right? How are they all using a shared data set? Now, if this is a problem that you currently have, I would say definitely come talk to us. We can help you with that. Now, that probably all sounds pretty cool, but it's probably time for us also to put it together in an example. So this particular scenario was happened actually, I think at this point a few months ago, maybe a little bit longer. But we had a Mandiant incident response engagement where they found or they discovered actually an active exploitation of the ConnectWise authentication bypass, right? And we quickly obviously added that insight to our threat intel service. We also made sure our managed services defenders used that intel in customer environments, right? They started to think about, okay, how do we not only detect this activity, but how do we start to create detections for it? We also made sure our attack surface management customers and their IT teams, right, would get this flagged so they could ultimately patch it, right, and weren't exposed to that particular malicious activity anymore. And then finally, the last piece here really is that for Google Security Operations, we also added curated detections that mitigated this particular issue, or at least highlighted it in your threat detection, investigation, and response workflow. Now, the one thing that's really cool about this story, right, or about this particular scenario is when we published the Mandiant blog that highlighted this new particular incident and the exploitation of it, right, at the bottom of that blog, for customers of Google Security Operations, we made it super easy for them to just say, oh yeah, deploy this in my environment just to make sure I'm not exposed. So before the public was even aware that this is something, right, that's an exploit in the wild that's being used, customers of Google Security Operations were protected. Now, this is really just the start, right? Everything I've talked about is, or are capabilities that are available today, right, to help you move away from doing things from a DIY perspective. But I do want to talk a little bit about what's coming, right? Because there's a lot of really cool things that are happening at the moment. So I think a lot of us probably remember WannaCry, right, from a few years ago. Probably not all that fondly, right? I think quite a few folks had very, very bad days, right, as is often the case in security. But that was probably until somebody discovered the kill switch, right, if you remember how WannaCry worked. Now, if you fast forward to now, We've got a very, very talented malware analyst, which is probably underselling him a little bit, but who also happens to be the founder of VirusTotal, called Bernardo, who has been playing around with large language models and AI in the context of malware analysis. And he really wanted to say, okay, how would a large language model analyze WannaCry in terms of, is it malicious or is it benign? And what ended up happening was, because of the actual context window of existing large language models, right, you would actually have to divide the code into chunks for WannaCry, right, and each chunk of code would get analyzed individually. Now, obviously, that meant the big picture was never seen, which also meant that it was pretty vague and non-specific in its outcomes, right? Now, the good news for us is, as I think pretty much everybody knows, right, Google is obviously investing a lot in AI, and we just recently launched our Gemini 1.5 Pro model, which has a very large context window, which is probably a bit of an understatement. But the gist of that very large context window is Bernardo could now have Gemini look at the entire WannaCry code base and ultimately say, hey, is this malicious or is it benign? Now, that analysis took 34 seconds, and this is what it found. The result is pretty clear here, right? The summary provided by Gemini 1.5 Pro is absolutely accurate. The verdict is, hey, it's malicious, it's ransomware. There's loads of details here, right? But at the end of the day, probably my favorite is the bit that says, oh, and by the way, there's a URL and domain that's being used for C2, which is the kill switch, right? In 34 seconds. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, you're probably saying, well, maybe this is because Gemini was trained on WannaCry and how it works, right, and could ultimately be based on that particular piece, but that's not the case at all here, right? We actually, or Bernardo, did a whole slew of analysis using Gemini in the context of zero-day malware, and the same results were present, right? Where ultimately Gemini was able to analyze that zero-day malware and to say, hey, is it malicious or benign, after it was fact-checked by an actual VirusTotal malware analyst. Now, if this is the kind of thing that you're interested in, right, I would say I definitely cannot do this justice. So Bernardo wrote an awesome blog, very technical, very detailed, with all the prompts and all the things that he looked at. That's available on the Google Cloud blog. It's called From Assistant to Analyst, which kind of gets you, I think, the direction that he was going. But definitely go read that. It's absolutely worth the read. Now, the bottom line, and why I even bring this up, is at the end of the day, we are at the start of that journey, right? We're at the start of the journey of how security operations really should evolve, right? So we can ultimately finally say goodbye to DIY. Now, at the end of the day, what I'll leave you with here is a couple of things. So some of you are probably very interested in, okay, you keep talking about what are the insights you get from the front lines, what are threat intel? A great place to get a sense of what that looks like is to actually read our MTrends report, which inspects everything that we've done in 2023 in terms of incident response engagements, the trends that we saw, what it means, et cetera. I would also say if you want to get hands-on with Gemini or Google Security Operations or Google Threat Intel, and you're like, you know what, I love listening to presentations, but I really want to play with this thing, right? Definitely go visit our experts in the booth. They're showing all of this live in production environments. They can walk you through all the details. You can ask questions as much as you want. Now, if you just want to sort of stay up to date, hey, what's Google up to in security? One of the easiest ways to do that is to join our Google Cloud Security community. We generally, any kind of major announcements or anything that we're up to, we post there. And it's a great way to actually interact with our experts. Now, with that, I would say thank you. If you have questions, please come and find me after the session. I think we're going to do that outside. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you.